So indeed, today the title of the talk is Better SEO and Sharing on Social Media Platforms with Angular Universal. See if my pointer works. Yes. So, some things to learn or perhaps recap today for people who already have experience with Angular Universal. Just briefly, we're going to talk about what is the goal of Angular Universal. We're not going in depth about how we're going to set up Universal, but we're going to see more what are the benefits that we can get with Angular Universal. We're going to also briefly discuss why and when not to implement Universal. And we're going to see how we can optimize the rendering, the server-side rendering of our application for search engine optimization, social sharing, and user experience. And last but definitely not least, how does dependency injection help with this? First, a short introduction about me. I'm 31 years young. I recently became a father of Milo, given by my my beautiful girlfriend Zoe. And I'm a freelance software engineer. I'm also the co-organizer of NGBE, the Belgian Angular Conference, and also of the Angular Belgium meetup. And again, this year, beginning of December, we're organizing our 4th edition. And I have to thank our sponsors, and especially Ordina, who is the main and platinum sponsor of this event. So, the big question, what is the goal of Universal? The goal is to run Angular anywhere and framework agnostic. That's the main goal of Universal. Now, what does that mean exactly? Angular anywhere means that we can run it in different contexts. For example, in the browser, which is the typical case of a front-end framework to run it in the browser. We can run it on the server, which is an advanced case. Today, that's our case. But even hardcore, we can run it in a worker in the browser. But the question to ask here is, would that make sense to do? Typically, a typical example of a worker is if you have a lot of data that you want to process, you would offload that processing power to a worker to not block the main thread of the UI. But that has nothing to do with Angular. You can just use pure JavaScript to do some processing of data. So I haven't seen a valid case yet where I run Angular in a worker, but if anybody of you know, please do let me know, because I haven't seen it before. Then framework agnostic. Well, there are some framework implementations that allow you to run Angular on the server. For example, for JavaScript, we have the Express or the Happy Engine. We also have an ASP.NET implementation. Plus, we have a generic solution. This generic solution will allow you to build your Angular Universal application on basically any server. So if your server has no native support for Angular Universal, like for example PHP, Python, Java, any other language or framework, you can use a tool called the socket engine to support any language. That basically means that as long as your framework, for example Java, Python framework, supports TCP connections, you can connect to a node instance, the socket engine, to generate the Angular Universal website for you. So the ultimate goal in our case of Universal is that we get to retrieve a stable state of the application, pre-render that stable state to static HTML on any server at run or at build time. Then, of course, you need to ask yourself, do I really need Universal? And there are some basic rules that you can, or questions that you can ask yourself. First of all, who is my user? Is your user of the application a potential customer of your web shop, for example? Or is it an employee in an enterprise application? What kind of website or web application are you building? Are you building an informative website, or are you building a CRUD application? Then another question is it an internal application or is it a public-facing website or web application? So the most important question forms around all these questions, and that is, would your application or the users of your application really benefit from universal? And what is the benefit? So some rules. Do use universal when you have a public-facing website, for example, an informative website or an application, or you need fast loading or time to interactive, or a fast first contentful paint is required. So some examples: a blog or a personal website, an informative company website, or for example product pages of a web shop. Then another question is, of course, would you use Angular for this? But that's not the scope today. My idea is that you have to use the tools that you know to solve a problem. So when would you not use universal? When your application is a pure CRUD application, or when it's behind a authentication mechanism, so when it's an internal application. For example, a back office of that same web shop that I mentioned before, an enterprise application, or perhaps a mobile application. When you use a mobile application or a progressive web app, there are other optimization techniques like offline caching, but you could still consider, if you really want, to pre-render the pages of your mobile application on the server. Then, of course, the main question about these rules is, why would you need to consider this? Because, of course, adding universal adds a lot of, well, not that much complexity to your application. For example, there are two main things that I consider complex things about universal, and one of them is that if you're developing for a browser, it does not necessarily mean that you have the same capabilities on any platform. For example, the window, navigator, document global objects, or the cookies and the storage API is not available on the server. You cannot get data from those objects or those APIs. So the main idea is that when you're developing an application for Angular Universal to render it on the server, you need to check the platform where your code is running on. And how do we do that? Simple example in Angular is we use several functions available by Angular: is platform server, is platform browser, is platform worker, to check with the platform ID on which platform that we're running. So for example, we have a service that does some stuff, and we check if our application is in a browser. We do things that work in the browser. If it's not, we do things that work in the server. Simply said, but that's the main idea. Now a more specific implementation, perhaps more real world application, is, for example, when you want to read out a cookie. You will read out a cookie in your front-end application by injecting some Angular library, NGX cookies, and you get the cookie from that cookie service. But on the server, you don't have cookies available that are available in the browser. So you get the cookie from the request. And that's why we have two optional dependencies. This means that not necessarily all of those dependencies are available on the same platform. So in case of the server, we read from the request, which is from our Express framework. In case of the browser, we read from a cookie service, which is a front-end implementation. So the good part about this is that we have only one service, and we can always call the same API. We just call myCookieService.getCookie, and we get the cookie. We don't care about the implementation. Then another complex thing about Universal is that we want to avoid reloading the data of our application. So we serialize and transfer the data state to the browser, and we use this as a cache-first mechanism on Bootstrap. That might be a little bit unclear, but I will show you with this nice graphics. So our browser requests a dynamic page, for example, a news detail page. The server talks to the database, gets some data, and server-side renders this page with that dynamic data. The server returns the full HTML and CSS and JavaScript that form our Angular application to the browser. At that point, it's still a static page. It's just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Our browser sees, interprets the JavaScript, sees, this is an Angular application. Browser bootstraps the Angular application, but as we have built our application in a platform agnostic way, Angular will bootstrap and it will see, it has this URL, I need to fetch the data. So it will fetch the data again from the server. And then rebuild that news page with the data from the server. Can we avoid that extra round trip to the server? Yes, we can. So same thing, we request a dynamic page. The server renders the page. And now we return the same full HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, but we extend it with all the data that was necessary to build up that page. So again, the same thing happens. Angular bootstraps, but now we use the cache first mechanism to check if something was already there, our state here, and we use that state to rebuild the news page. And we have avoided the extra round trip to the server. So remember that I told you that we want to have a stable state of our application, and we want to use that stable state to render the static HTML of the application. What is this? What is the stable application state, or how does Angular know when the application is stable? It's very important because we need to know when we want to render the static HTML of the application. We have a lot of async and reactive code, so when is it done? When is the application stable? And for the people who still remember AngularJS, there was this digest loop. That was a mess, a big mess. But now with Angular we don't have a digest loop anymore. We just process top down in the tree. So our application is stable when basically the zone is stable. Angular uses Zone.js to keep track of different operations like micro and macro tasks, meaning that it knows when there is a set timeout running. It knows when a promise is not resolved. It knows when some subscription to an observable is not completed or cancelled. And therefore, Angular exposes a property, an observable is stable on the application ref, which is a dependency of is a service given by Angular. And when this is stable observable emits a value, we know that our application is stable. So let's keep that in our head. We have an is stable observable on the application ref. So now you have your application built, and you did it with the best tools you had, and it's working fine, it's working good, your application is very fast, and then you give your output to an SEO expert. It's like, I don't find your page on Google. I cannot share that page on social media. It doesn't work. So how can we leverage Universal to help with search engine optimization and social sharing? There are different ways, and basically those ways are totally independent of Universal. The main idea is that you want to have meaningful initial content when you load the application, meaning it's static HTML, which is, of course, the input and the food for crawlers of Google, Bing, etc. And we want to have correct meta tags, title tags, alternate tags, whatever. And of course, other things like microdata or JSON-linked data, which give you a lot more context, detailed context of what your application or the page has to offer to your potential visitor. So initial content. Initial content, of course, is the full HTML of your page. It contains the vital information, metadata for the first crawl by search engines. And of course, the user does not have to wait for initial content. It directly sees something on the page, which is good for user retention and not to bounce off the user. Then, of course, correct usage of meta tags, meta description, meta OG title, whatever. We have to output as much data as we can to serve all search engines. But all search engines behave differently. And just to explain, for me, a search engine is not only Google or Bing. A search engine for me is also Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. And why? Because they cache a lot of your a lot of the data that you share on those pages of Facebook. So how do you enable social sharing on those social media platforms? You use meta tags. But Facebook and LinkedIn, they use the Open Graph meta tags. For example, OG title. And if you use Open Graph, you need to provide your value in the property attribute of the meta tag. If you use Twitter, you need to use a Twitter prefix, and you have to put it in the name attribute. And then Google, yeah, Google does who knows what, but you have to take care of the meta description tag because apparently that is still important. So how can we do this in Angular? As you can see, it's quite a big, quite some code to just set a title, but that's because there are so many different requirements for all those search engines and social media applications. So for just setting the title, we can use the meta service and the title service to update or remove the tags that are relevant to the different social media platforms. Yeah, we clean up, of course. The good thing is that all those social media platforms give you tools to validate the output of your application. For example, you have the Twitter card validator, you have a Facebook crawler debugger, LinkedIn post inspector, and the Google Search Console. Then, typically when you build a public-facing website or web application, what you do is you optimize the content that you deliver to the browser. And one of them is HTML minification. The less kilobytes you send to the browser, the better the experience, the faster your application will load. So you remove everything that is unnecessary. But you have to be careful, because like I said before, not all search engines behave the same way. They're not equally capable of parsing HTML and JavaScript. As an example, for example, this is the post inspector of LinkedIn that allows you to check how your link will preview when you share it on LinkedIn. So I just input my website, and this is all you see. This is not good, eh? I can show a proper title, I can show a description, I can show an image. But in this case, I have over-optimized my HTML. And that HTML looks like this. Can somebody see what's potentially wrong here? So this is just HTML, but it's over-optimized. And you don't need to look far, it's in the first line of code, but there's only one line. That's optimization, put just everything on one line that can put on one line. It's because I over-optimized. And what did I over-optimize? I over-optimized using HTML minifier with the remove attribute quotes and the remove optional tags. HTML5 does not require you to put all HTML tags. The browser is capable of fixing that for you. But not all browsers or search engines behave the same way. So we need to make sure that we get proper minify options by still keeping attribute quotes and optional tags. And now we get this result. What's the difference? Nobody sees it? There's a head tag. Yep. And that's the only thing that made LinkedIn fail. Probably, I don't know the details of LinkedIn, how its parser is behaving, but probably it's expecting the head tag to be there. And now it looks like this. And there is no documentation about this. I had to find out the hard way and test enabling, disabling all these options to see what was working. I wrote about it. Yes, I wrote about it on my blog. Yes, yes, yes. So this is how you want your social media preview to be looking. This is what you want. Then, how does dependency injection help with us with this? We want to inject the right service depending on the platform, and that allows us to use the same API. And we need to do no platform check while we're coding. As an example, I'm going to talk about JSON-linked data. Now, what is JSON-linked data? A short introduction. It's just structured data that gives more context to your application. So, for example, on a product page of a web shop, it gives 4 out of 5 stars rating. It's an article. It's of that type of article. And it allows you to interlink across the internet. And it's an alternative to microdata. But I'm not going to go into depth about those details. Just need to know it's very good for search engine optimization. This is an example which is on my own website. You just give it the context. The context is just the name of the library that holds all the definitions of the types. And each type has a given set of properties that you can fill in to give more context about that type. So, back to universal. Rendering JSON linked data is only relevant on the server. And why is that? Because search engines are not navigating client-side. If they go visit and index all your pages, they visit them separately. They don't have a browser clicking on the buttons, on the links. No, they visit all the pages separately. So the only place to render it is on the server. But of course, we want to do this platform independent. We just want to call set JSON linked data or whatever. And now we come back to the isTable observable. The isTable observable also gives you extra hooks. And those hooks you can add to your application using the before app serialized token in Angular. So this callbacks that you provide to before app serialized, you can put as many as you want, are executed as soon as the observable isTable gives you a value. And for this, I need to explain a little bit more about how we would code the JSON-LD module. And for that, I will go back to a basic of Angular Universal. Typically, our Angular application starts from an app module. App module has some imports like the browser module, common module, whatever, app routing module, whatever is good for your application. But here we inject the browser JSON linked data module. If we want to pre-render that application on the server, we use the app server module, which is basically just an extension of an override, no, an extension of app module because we import it here. And here we provide the server JSON-LD module. In our browser JSON-LD module, we just provide a service which gives you an interface or a function to just say this data for this page, please inject it on the page. The server JSON-LD module is just an extension. It does the same thing, gives you the JSON-LD service, but it adds an extra hook in the before app serialized, which will serialize the data and append it to the head of your page. So this just gets executed when the application is stable and right before it renders your application. So yeah, this function injects the JSON-LD state. And this is what you get in the end result. You get all your meta tags with the correct attributes, property, name, and the script tag which holds the application JSON-LD data, and of course all the other statically rendered HTML of your application. You don't have to code this yourself. I've already did it and I've shared it. So you can just install ngx SEO, and then you just have to call some functions with your data, and then it will all work for you. Not many people are using it. Perhaps from today on, more people will be using it. All you have to do is install it and use it. That's easy, right? So, let's conclude. The goal of Angular Universal is to run Angular everywhere, in the server, in the browser, perhaps in the worker if you really find the case. We use it to run Angular server and technology agnostic. The rendered version of our application is always based on the stable state of our application. That means that Angular is capable of detecting when your application should be rendered. There are different ways to optimize for search engine optimization and social sharing. It gives your visitors and, of course, search engines a fast and meaningful initial content. And you can put valid meta tags for all social media platforms to be able to pre-render or preview the link that you're sharing on those platforms. JSON linked data gives you a way to output structured data that provides more context to your application. And of course, all the search engines and social media platforms give us tools to validate our implementations. For that, we can make use of dependency injection. We can do different things on different platforms, on the server, in the browser, or in the worker. And by using dependency injection, we can keep the same API but change functionality under the hood depending on the platform. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I don't know if there's still room for questions. Some time for questions? Yeah. So please, if anybody has questions. No questions? It's low. It's low, yes. That's correct, that's correct. Yes, and yeah. Yes, correct, yeah. So indeed, Angular Universal is not used very much. I think mainly because not many people know of its correct capabilities or full potential. And of course there are other tools, more standardized, more common known tools, like just CMS platforms, that will give you statically generated content. But if your team knows Angular and it needs to code a platform or a big informative website with lots of components and this and that, it's very easy to extend your Angular application to be server-side rendered. Yes. There are some examples. For example, the football club Chelsea, their website is Angular Universal. And there's a big telco operator in France, I can't remember its name, it's also server-side rendered Angular. My own website is, but that should be. I just chose that technology because I wanted to play with Angular Universal. So. And if you would compare it to like React with Gatsby, Gatsby is it's promoted by a company, so that's why it's probably more popular in React to do server-side rendering than you would use Angular to do server-side rendering. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for your attention.